So yeah, as far as kind of the format, you can feel free to raise your hand throughout the discussion. Aaron's really comfortable with having a kind of an open flow discussion. He'll do his presentation. Feel free to raise your hand, use the chat. I'll interrupt, or maybe Aaron if he sees questions as we go along. Yeah, pretty casual. If anyone has any questions or comments, feel free to mention them to me. If anyone's on by phone and not able to get a question in, if you've got a pen handy, my cell phone number is 608-228-6617. So if you'd feel more comfortable texting me a question, I can relay it that way. Yeah, other than that, I think we may just get started. I think Aaron's kind of got a little bit of an introduction in his presentation. I know Aaron through our position with the Grassworks board, so a little shout out for Grassworks, and thank you, Aaron. I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Thanks for letting me talk about grazing today. Nothing I like more. So, cut right to the chase here. Oops, if it'll let me. There we go. So again, my name is Aaron Pape. So my wife and I, Aaron and I know Aaron's, we run Pape Family Pastures, which is a 110-acre farm up here in Peshtigo, about an hour north of Green Bay. And then my day job is as a farm business instructor for Northeast Wisconsin Technical College. So I work with about 55 farms scattered throughout far northeastern Wisconsin on all sorts of financial and production farm issues. So our main enterprises on the farm are grass-fed beef. So here's a snap of some of our herd. There is belted Galloways and Aberdeen Angus for the most part, with a few other mutts thrown in. We also do pastured pigs. We did about 11 or 12 of those this year. And then we raise pastured broiler chickens as well. So we produced 720 broilers on pasture this year in Joel Salatin style pens. So grazing, you're all here because you're interested in grazing, and there's a lot of reasons why I love grazing and everybody else does too. It's good for the land. When you see beautiful, well-managed pasture, you got tons of soil cover, you're feeding the soil biology through those roots, protecting the soil from erosion, improving the water cycle, all that stuff. Good managed pasture is excellent for the health of the land. It's good for the animals. The animals are out there outside, fresh air, not standing on concrete. They're eating the forages that they were made to eat. It's a good lifestyle for the animals as well. And it's a good lifestyle for us as the farmers. My wife and I, we run this farm by ourselves. It doesn't take a whole heck of a lot of capital to get started. It's an active lifestyle. We're out walking around with the cows, playing with the pigs. It's a good life. Most of the chores involve moving fence, and so it's not too complicated. You're going out for a stroll in the pasture, taking a handful of posts and a reel. So it's a win-win-win. Good for the land, good for the animals, and good for us. But that being said, those benefits of good rotational grazing and well-managed pastures, that doesn't get to happen unless that farm business is actually making money. And so that's really what I'm here to talk to you guys about tonight. So I'm going to give you a quick perspective on kind of farm enterprise profitability, comparing cropland and grazing enterprises. Then we're going to spend most of the time talking about some tips and advice on how to actually build a profitable grazing business. What are some of the principles that we should be following to ensure profitability? I'm going to give my 2 cents of advice on beginning grazers. If I could do this all over again, some things that I would probably do differently. And then I will run through the grazing spreadsheets that you guys got emailed out before. So you can use those on your own. So farm business profitability. There's definitely this myth in agriculture about, kind of the juxtaposition of cropland and pasture land. So many times when I've been working with farmers and trying to convince them to convert from cropland to pasture, they say, well, that's too good a ground for me to graze. It's too valuable. Well, I looked at the 2019 Iowa Farm Survey, where they look at net farm revenues, various financial standards, and just looking at the corn profitability on a cash basis in 2019, the average Iowa farm made $70.13 an acre. So that's cash basis. That means it's only money, direct expenses, money going out, and revenues coming in. But when we include depreciation, so that's devaluation, wear and tear, replacement of machinery and buildings, they actually have a net revenue of minus $1.49. And if we look at that on a full economic basis, so that means we're accounting for the value of unpaid labor and owner contributions. We're accounting for opportunity costs. We're accounting for capital expenses. Basically, they're losing $167 an acre. And so that's not exactly a great way to make money, regardless of what people might think. When you really account for all the true costs of production, growing corn isn't exactly a get-rich-quick scheme either. And we look at the return on assets. So all the stuff that a farm owns in order to generate income, what is the return that they're getting on all that capital? It's only a meager 2.7%. So how does that compare with a grass-fed beef operation? That's going to be the basis of what I'm going to talk about tonight anyways. So a lot of you are probably familiar with Laura Payne. She did a study with SARE back in 2010, looking at the cost of production for grass-fed beef producers. And she broke those producers down at the low, medium, and high cost producer categories. And they needed a break-even price, hanging weight-wise, of $1.48, $2.93, and $5.77 respectively. So that's a huge range in values, from very low cost to extremely high cost producers. Now, if we take a look at the Wisconsin Grass-Fed Beef Co-op as an example of what a farmer could get for a pay price through a branded labeling program, the Grass-Fed Beef Co-op pays around $2.25 a pound hanging weight for carcasses. So on a 620 pound carcass, one of those low cost producers could expect to make around $150 an acre. Well, that's a far cry better than even on a cash basis, that $70 an acre that a corn farmer in Iowa was making. But that's the best case scenario, a very low cost producer. We see that there's a lot of variability and a lot of people above those costs. Jim Munch, some of you might know him from Southwest Wisconsin. He's done a lot of work with CIAS, done a lot of financials work. He did a survey of Wisconsin grass-fed beef producers about 10 years ago. He saw returns from anywhere from $0 an acre to about $120 an acre, and everywhere in between. And so the long and short of it is, yes, there's absolutely money to be made in grazing, but the key is that you have to be a good manager, and particularly managing your costs. And so we're going to talk a lot about that tonight. And then on the dairy side, grazing dairy heifers to me is a complete no-brainer. If you're raising heifers in confinement, you're looking at anywhere from $1.50 to $2.50 per head per day for raising costs. Depends on if you're doing them at home or if you're having them custom raised. If you're grazing those same heifers, it's going to cost you about 50 cents per head per day. And so if you're spending half the year with your heifers on pasture, half the year at home in confinement, you're going to cut your heifer raising costs in half. So on 100 heifers, you could have a savings of about $37,000 a year. And so not only do we have financial incentives to put heifers out on grass, but heifers come into the barn healthier and they're more productive their first lactation than heifers that are raised in confinement. So grazing dairy heifers is a great opportunity to get more pasture on the landscape, get cattle out, and really make a farm some money. So long and short of this all is that there is opportunities to make money in grazing. You just have to do it right. And so we're going to try to get you on the right track with that tonight. So how are we going to build this profitable grazing farm? Well, the basic simplified formula for profit is income minus costs. And so we can attack two sides of that. We can attack the costs by reducing those costs, or we can find ways to increase the income. So I'm going to use this grazing spreadsheet that you guys all got emailed out to you today. So basically use this as an example for a baseline farm, and to demonstrate how different principles that we're going to talk about in terms of saving costs and increasing income could impact our bottom line. And so there's four main parts of that spreadsheet. There's the stocking page where we have, can you guys see my mouse if I'm mousing on here? Anybody shake your head? Yeah, thanks, John. So we've got our stocking sheet here. We put in our animal numbers and weights and things, put in our forage supply, residency period, and it shows us if we're in balance with the land base that we have. Then we have a winter feeding spreadsheet where we put in our first days of feeding and last day of feeding, gives us the number of days we need to feed, put in our price of hay, animal numbers, all that sort of stuff. Tells us how much hay we're going to need and what it's going to cost us. Then we've got a financial spreadsheet where we put in our carcass weights, our pay prices, a whole bunch of other stuff that you can't actually see on here right now that gives us a number for what we could expect as a return per acre of pasture on variable costs. And that's the number we're going to be looking at mostly tonight, just for simplicity's sake. And then on the last page, we've got our fixed costs. So that's our land charges, our pasture costs, and our depreciation. And then we add that all in to give us an actual true net return. And in this baseline scenario, we're actually going to be losing $76 an acre when we account for all those fixed costs as well. So that is the real basic rundown of what we're looking at here. There's going to be a lot of screenshots of the spreadsheet to show what's going on. And so that's the basics of how it works. So some disclaimers and assumptions before we really dive in. So the example that we'll be using tonight is on a grass-fed beef finishing operation. But all of those grazing principles that we're going to talk about in terms of how to improve profitability, will apply to really any sort of livestock grazing enterprise. The main purpose of this tool is to examine the directionality and magnitude of management changes. It's not a accounting tool. It's, you can't pick up all your receipts and throw them in here and give you the exact number of how much money you made. That's not what this tool is intended for. It's too rough for that, quite honestly. Some other assumptions of this spreadsheet: it assumes that you're finishing all the calves that you produce from those cows and that you're buying in replacements. Just made the spreadsheet simpler to produce. Obviously, that's not the reality on many, if not most farms. Finishing animals for 2 winters, and we're finishing them around 26 months. Some of you very high ambitious people might be able to get away with it in just 1 winter, but most people it's 2 winters, so that's what the default is here. And then those default cost values that we have elsewhere are derived from the average of many farms that I've worked with over the last 5 years, 6 years. So your costs are definitely going to differ potentially significantly from what I have. And so that's why, again, it's a model to show us directionality. It's not to give you an exact number that you're going to take to the bank. And one thing that definitely is going to differ a lot is overheads, which we're going to talk more about that later. And then finally, I need to give a big shout out to Serge Koenig, pictured here. Serge and I worked together my first job back in Stock County, and he's the one who really got me started on grazing. And we started working on these spreadsheets together, five, 6 years ago. And it's kind of taken off from there. So I owe a lot to Serge, and he's a great guy. He's already texted me he's not going to be on tonight, but wish me luck. So appreciate that. All right.
I guess maybe I was going to say this is maybe a good break if anyone has any questions or clarifications or discussion points right away before we delve into the next section. And I see I did email all the people that had registered up until like 6 o'clock the spreadsheets. So if you didn't get that, feel free to send me your email and I'll make sure that you get them. All right, anyone? All right.
All right, I'll keep trucking on then.
Perfect.
All right, so first things first, we're going to talk about all sorts of magic bullets, not really, for how to improve profitability. But when it comes down to it, if your pastures look like this instead of this, that's what we need to address first. If we've got overstocked, unrotated pastures, very unproductive, selective grazing going on, basically nothing else that you can do is going to really solve the problem until we attack this grazing management issue. So if you're not moving your animals at least every 3 days, that's a serious priority. Are we stocked appropriately? Not overstocked. That's generally the issue. If you just don't have enough forage for the animals that you have out there, you're not going to be able to do a whole heck of a lot else to improve things. And also understocking. You know, if you don't have enough animals, grass is getting mature on you, underutilization, you know, that's not good either. And then making sure we're maintaining adequate rest periods, making sure that grass is able to recover and you got good forage out there for the next time those animals come around. So just following those basic principles of good grazing management, that is the first priority. So that being said, let's get into the real nitty gritty here. So the number one cost on any livestock operation is stored feed. And so what do we need to do? Well, maybe we can find some cheaper feed. So a typical Wisconsin purchased hay price for a decent grass legume mix that we'd feed to beef cattle, I found anywhere from $85 to $120 a ton is a fairly typical range. Of course, you'll see the shysters on Craigslist trying to sell round bales for 80, 90 bucks a bale like they were this summer. But most people aren't going to be paying for that sort of ridiculous price for hay. So in the spreadsheet scenario that I have for us tonight, and this is the number I use for general planning purposes anyways, is $100 a ton for hay. I buy a lot of $40 round bales, you know, in that 800 pound range. And so that you do the math, that comes out to $100 a ton. And I think that's a pretty good starting number. You might have it different, but that's a good number, I think, for most planning purposes. So you might be saying to yourself, but I'm not buying hay. I make hay way cheaper than that. Well, without going line by line here, if we look at establishment costs of hay, fertilizing it appropriately, and all our harvesting costs, we can expect a cost per ton of dry matter to be about $67 a ton for decent grass alfalfa hay. So that's a lot cheaper than $100 a ton, no doubt. But what is our land cost in that as well? So just my farm as an example, my property taxes are $8 an acre. I've got a land contract payment on it for $66 an acre. So at that 3.2 tons an acre of hay production, I need to add another $23.12 a ton to that hay cost. So now my actual cost is $90.13 a ton. So we're right into that ballpark of what I'm paying for hay anyways. How about your time? Making hay is a tremendous amount of time. I think there's probably nothing that I dislike more than driving on the tractor, pulling a hay bine, or pulling a rake. It's just nothing good about it other than I get to listen to my good farming podcast. So what is your time worth to you? And then I haven't even talked about the initial outlay cost of that equipment, repairs and depreciation that all goes into owning and operating that haying equipment. So that hay that you think you're making so cheap might not be so cheap after all, is what I'm getting at. And so that being said, it's not, I'm not completely opposed to making hay, that's for sure. And in fact, I think one good place to potentially do it is to make some first crop hay off of your pastures. Maybe 10 to 15% of your acres for beef and up to 25% of your acres for dairy. Depends on how tightly your animals are stocked. The reason why I say 10, 15 for beef and 25 for dairy is because beef cattle, we're looking for a taller growth, not as quite a high quality. With dairy, we're looking for tighter rotations and higher quality forage, so we can afford to take a little bit more on that first rotation. This can be very cost effective. You can see here, if we just look at our harvesting costs for making baleage, because if we've got really nice grass legume pastures, like I grow the Byron Grassworks mix, I'm sure a lot of you do, it's very difficult to get that stuff dry. And so I found baleage to be the best way to preserve that. And one of the big side benefits and why I'm particularly okay with making some first crop hay off of that is because it helps us to manage our pasture quality. So it doesn't take very long for our pastures to go from, you know, primo quality grass like this to stemmy seeded out hay or pasture like this. And I think that was like 10 days. And so if you can't keep up with it, like you usually can't during that spring flush, haying strategically to try to maintain your quality, I think is a good idea. Just one word of caution about doing that though, is that subsequent pasture productivity will definitely suffer from that nutrient removal. And so we need to make sure that we're doing proper nutrient management. We need to be feeding the hay back onto that pasture during the winter. or maybe we're spreading manure on that after we harvested that we had from a bed pack from the wintertime, or we just need to go put some fertilizer out there. So if we're putting nutrients back out in the form of manure or fertilizer, that's an additional cost. And so again, our really cheap hay is not quite as cheap as we might have hoped it would be. Just as a rule of thumb, for every ton of dry matter you take off of a pasture and hay, you need to put back 50 pounds of nitrogen, 12 pounds of phosphorus, and 45 pounds of potassium to restore those nutrients that you moved. All right, some other stuff about saving money on feed costs. Buy low, sell high. So hay prices can be cyclical. They're definitely volatile. I mean, even looking at this past year as an example, I don't know, in May, June, even early July, people were asking ridiculous amounts of money for their hay. But by the middle of summer, the end of summer, prices really settled in. And so being strategic about when you're purchasing hay goes a long ways to saving money. And making sure that you're not in a situation that you have to buy. You know, having some reserve is a real good idea. So my advice is buy a bunch when it's cheap and store it. And the easiest, most cost-effective way to do that is to put it on pallets and put it under a tarp. I've got hay that's 3 years old that's under tarps right now that we're going to feed this winter. And when I take a peek at it, it's perfectly good quality. As long as you keep it off the ground and keep it dry, it'll keep for a long time. If you're lucky enough to have a shed or a barn to keep it in, all the better. This is a quote you can take with you. I always say this to my wife: never let a good deal on hay pass you by. So that's an Aaron Pape truism for you. And I learned this because of, through all good experiences, you get burned. You get in a situation where you need some hay, and so you end up paying 50 or 60 bucks a bale. Whereas if you had bought 2 more truckloads of that $40 or $35 a bale load that you had a few months ago, then you wouldn't be in this position. So when you got a good deal, buy it all. Some other ways to reduce feed costs.
Sorry, Megan.
Yep.
Had a question about testing hay and hay quality.
Yeah.
Do you have that conversation with the person that you're buying hay from often, or how do you go about?
No, I haven't. I do test hay. Because I'm raising beef cattle, it doesn't really matter too much. I mean, you generally get a pretty good idea of it by looking at it, but it's a good idea, particularly if you're feeding higher classes of animals that need higher nutrition.
Can you share where you get it tested and how much it costs, or kind of what that protocol?
Yeah, so testing dry hay, you use a hay probe that you can get from Extension, and you drill it into the side of a bunch of bales. You should test at least 10 bales, mix that in with like a gallon Ziploc bag, and throw that in the mail to the UW Forage and Soils Lab in Marshfield. I think it's $35 a sample. Does that sound right? People that know something. I think it's 35 bucks a sample. And so, yeah, you test each lot individually, and then you get an idea of what you're actually feeding, and know if you need to do any other additional supplementation, or how you can mix batches of hay to make sure that your cattle are getting a balanced diet. So, but I would say in general, I buy a lot of second crop grass, a little bit of legume hay. That usually ends up, with like 10 to 12% protein and maybe 120 RFQ. And so it's usually good enough. In my older days, I have bought some crummy hay that wasn't good for much more than bedding, and you get a test back and it's like 6% protein and 84% RFQ. And then what seemed like a good deal, because I got that for like 30 bucks a bale, ends up being a very bad deal because you spent a whole bunch of money on something that the cows aren't even going to eat. So yeah, don't chintz on hay quality for sure. I mean, don't buy stuff better than you really need, but don't buy cheap, crummy quality hay, because you end up wasting money on it because they're not going to eat it.
And then Kevin had a comment about also bringing in weed seeds with hay, and the benefit of baleage is fermenting and cooking the weed seeds.
Yeah,
so
that's true.
And
That
then
is true.
hay samples are $16. But yeah, there is a lot of discussion in the pros and cons of baleage. I know more and more people that are leaning towards it.
So I love baleage, and I'll talk a little more about baleage here just a second. You just got to have the equipment to handle it. And then feeding it isn't quite as easy as it is dry hay. I'll get into that in just a minute. But yeah, those are great points. I'd say as far as the weed seeds go, I know it's there. Like, and I'll show you pictures of how I outwinter. Like, I had so much hogweed where I outwintered a couple of years ago. It's pretty gross, but I'm gonna clip it a couple of times next year and it'll be gone. You know, like, that's what I found. You clip those areas where the weeds are and they disappear. So I know. There's a trade-off. There's no perfect system. There's trade-offs to everything. So speaking of baleage, there's a lot of interest these days in some like alternative forages, particularly annuals. So sorghum sedan grass in particular is one of my favorites. Teff, I'm going to plant some of that this year. I'm going to do 11 acres of that as an experiment to see how I like that. Oats and peas, that's an old standby. Triticale rye, a lot of these different annuals. You might have various reasons for doing that. I use annuals to kind of remediate outwintering areas. If you want a large volume of high quality forage from a piece of cropland, you get more tonnage from annuals than you will perennials. And so depending on the situation, you can use these strategically to supplement your pastures during the summer potentially, or to extend the grazing season, which I'll get into more later. But so I like the Yield Max stuff that Dan Olson sells through Byron. And so here's my cost of production for this year. So I got a dry matter yield of 3.8 tons to the acre. And so when it's all said and done, it cost me $112 a ton. So it's pretty darn cost effective. It's more than I'm paying for dry hay, but it's way higher quality than dry hay too. It's like 16% protein, really high digestibility. So it's really good stuff. High sugar, from that sorghum sedan. So really nice stuff. But I hate harvesting. It's like $145 an acre in harvesting costs to make those 2 crops of baleage. And so like to me, that hurts. That's a lot of expense. When I have cows, I can go out there and do it for me. And so what if we would graze that annual mix instead? Well, if we take out those harvesting costs, now we've got a cost per ton of $61.29. You might be thinking, well, why would I want to graze that instead of make baleage out of it? This was the first crop getting knocked down by my custom guy. Really nice stuff. Why would I want to graze it? Because then in the fall, I can do this. So I've got this sorghum sandgrass sitting out there right now that my cows are going to eat in like 20 days. When everything else is dead and snow covered, this stuff will still be out there. So that is my segue into the next section here about extending the grazing season. There's probably nothing that you can do more to save money on your grazing operation than graze as long as possible into the year. So here I've got in our spreadsheet, my last day of grazing is November 1st. My first day is May 12th. So that means we're feeding for 192 days. And you might say, well, I don't graze, or I graze a lot later than that. You might, because you're on this webinar and you're interested in good grazing management. But there's a lot of cattle operations out there that really, they're not grazing much past that date. And so they're going to feed hay for 192 days. And so that's our baseline scenario here. Remember, we're looking at just the variable cost on this page, but we've got a return of $38 in that scenario. So what if we're able to stretch our grazing till deer season? That's always my baseline. Like, if I make it to deer season every year, I've accomplished what I need to do. And so November 20th is opening day of deer season this year. So if I make it till there, which looks like we're on track to do, I'm going to feed for 173 days instead of 192. So that 19 additional days of grazing just bought me $32.46 an acre more in a return on my operation. So that's a big cost savings. What if we're able to stretch our grazing out until December 15th? So now we're 44 days past that November 1st date. Now we've picked up an additional $75 an acre in revenue from our grazing. So like I said, there's probably nothing that you can do to impact your bottom line more than figure out how to graze longer into the year. But that is easier said than done. It's just what keeps me awake at night and what I annoy my wife with random conversations throughout the day is how do we extend our grazing season longer? Well, there's basically, in my mind, there's 3 ways to do this. You can stockpile pasture. So this is my cows yesterday. We got that snow and they're eating right through it. How you make sure that you have grass for that late into the year is a whole other discussion that probably we can talk about later, but probably shouldn't go into too long. But basically, you got to be able to figure out how to let that grass rest long enough that it can pile up until later in the year here. One thing that I am coming to realize there's probably a lot of benefit to is applying nitrogen in August. I've never done that before, but we've got a new piece of pasture that we fenced this year, really low organic matter, really nutrient depleted. And where we grazed it the first time, anywhere there was a cow pie, that grass was probably 14 inches tall when we came back around, and the rest of the grass around it was like 6 inches tall. Now that's because it's really beat up ground and new seeding, all that. But the fact remains, if I'd put out 100 pounds of urea out there, I'd have easily gained 1.5 tons of dry matter from that $25 per acre application. I mean, that would have been well worth the investment. So that's something I'm definitely going to consider for next year. And I know folks like Gene Schriefer, do that and probably recommend it. I know some folks in the grazing community are opposed to synthetic nitrogen and whatnot, but from an economic basis, man, it makes a whole heck of a lot of sense. So I might try that on a few acres next year. I guess here, I don't know if from the crowd, anybody applying nitrogen in the fall? We want to chime in? John's shaking his head. Nobody else? Okay. Other ways that you can extend your grazing season, cover crops. So this is Italian ryegrass. This is actually what would be the 3rd cutting of that yield max. But instead of cutting it, I just graze it. But so this gave me an opportunity to get my cows off my perennial pastures, give those a longer rest, so I'd stockpile. In the meantime, they're eating some really high quality grass over here. And so you can do the same thing with any sort of cover crops, particularly like after wheat, or you got somebody that's planting some oats, or find some opportunities to get your cattle on some cover crops somewhere. So here's just a random picture from the internet, but you can see we got some sorghum sudan grass, got some sunflowers, some sort of brassicas out here. Looks like maybe a turnip there or something. Cover crops on cropland, a great way to give your pastures a rest and extend the available forage into the fall. So here's my cattle last winter grazing that sorghum sudan grass. There's the sorghum sudan, hairy vetch, rape, red clover, and annual ryegrass that I planted. And yeah, good stuff. And as far as quality goes, the proof's in the cow pie. It might look pretty crummy, it's big, dry, dead looking stuff, but the quality is fantastic. That's a perfectly balanced beef diet right there. Got a question, Rachel?
I like the cow pie pictures, yeah.
Okay. You can't go a presentation.
We'll pause at the cow pie. I know.
I got a phone full.
I know. Yeah, cows, kids, and cow pies. So there's a question from Dennis that says, what grass species do you feel gives you the best stockpile yields and quality in your area, which is Northeast Wisconsin?
Yeah. So I would say it's kind of by default. I would say orchard grass, which is not known as a good stockpiling grass, but the reason why it actually works is because the cattle don't graze it as low because they don't like it as much as the meadow fescue and festuolium that is also in my pastures. And so in the fall, what has the longest residual length of any of my grasses? It's orchard grass. And so in October, that stuff is going to grow back faster than the rest of my higher quality grasses. And so, yeah, like tonight when I went out to move the cows, there's a whole heck of a lot of orchard grass in that next paddock they were going into. And, that stuff is probably 12 inches tall when the meadow fescue is like 6 inches tall. So it's not because orchard grass is particularly good at stockpiling. It's just the cows didn't eat it as well the last time they were through. So that's what I find a lot. Also because it's a really highly bunching bunch grass, it just tends to stick up well in the snow. The cows can find it for pretty late in the fall. So I wouldn't say that I would necessarily recommend it though. I mean, the tall fescue is the gold standard for winter stockpiling, but I don't recommend tall fescue for anything. So
that was one of the other questions, was considering endophyte friendly tall fescue. And I think that,
I don't know, if you had nothing but a fescue clover field with no other grasses, I guess it would be fine because they wouldn't have any choice. But
it could be something to take 8 cuttings off during the year too. Yeah, if you had it.
Yeah. If you wanted to use it strategically, I think that would be fine. But as far as part of a general pasture mix, man, it doesn't play well with others. The cows just don't like it. Even the new stuff, like the leaf texture, is just they don't want to eat it.
So yeah, similar to orchard grass, where it'd be the one thing that's left up.
Yeah. So I guess it would work for stockpiling for sure, but for the rest of the year, you wouldn't want it. So
there's another question about your nitrogen. For the August application of nitrogen, how did you arrive at the rate of 100 pounds per acre?
Because that's what UW-Madison recommends. There've been a lot of university studies about response to nitrogen and what's an optimal rate, and 100 pounds of urea equals 46 pounds of N applied, and that's a good rate. Did I say urea? Did I say N? Nitrogen, actual nitrogen. Yeah, urea. So 46 pounds of nitrogen. It doesn't matter where it comes from, I guess, but that's what I would use.
And then another question is your sorghum Sudan grass cocktail mix for late season winter grazing. And can you talk about that, the utilization of that a little bit more?
Yeah, so where I plant this stuff is where I bale graze the winter before. When you're done bale grazing, it's pretty beat up, and I've learned through trial and error that, in my experience, the best thing to do is to just plow it up and start over. The compaction that they cause, particularly in the spring when it's mud season, the pasture is just dopey after that. It just does not want to, it doesn't grow back nearly as vigorous as you'd like it to. And even with all that nutrient applied, the soil damage is too much. So I end up plowing it up and planting this annual cocktail mix. And then I have that for grazing in July, and then I leave it grow until November. And then it's still standing there for me to graze now.
Anyone have any other comments or questions? All right, well, we'll keep rolling.
All right, so something I'm real interested in and would like to do, but haven't had the opportunity yet, is to utilize corn. I wouldn't do pure corn, but corn in a mixture for winter grazing. You have cornfields standing all winter long, and that's one of the real problems with pretty much any other species that you might try to utilize as a late season forage, is that eventually the snow just breaks it all down. And so with utilizing a fair percentage of your mix in corn, you might be able to get enough standability that you could really extend your grazing season well into February, maybe even March, depending on how many acres you had. Quality would definitely deteriorate throughout the winter, but you'd definitely be able to gain a few months. I know Justin Seeger, he's in your neck of the woods, right, Rachel?
Yep.
Yeah, he does some of this, which I'm super jealous of. And this is a picture actually from Alberta. In Alberta, they do a lot of standing corn grazing. Talk about super cost-effective winter feed. I mean, you got no harvesting costs. You're producing 6-7 tons of dry matter per acre. It would be really, really cheap feed. So something I would definitely try in the future. And for those of you who have the opportunity to do that, I'd definitely give it a shot. So basically just trying to figure out any way that you can grow something that's going to be there for your animals to graze when nothing else is growing. So, all right, enough on winter feeding. So there's some kind of basic herd management things that can make an impact on your bottom line. One of those is calving rates. The industry standard is 90%. calving success. And so if you're struggling to reach that standard, you know, something might be going on. Your nutrition program might be off. You might have some sort of herd health issue going on. You know, you might have a viral infection or something going on with your animals. And so, you know, getting down to the root of that, figuring out what's stopping you from achieving decent calving success. Because otherwise you're just feeding cows for nothing, and that is just dead weight. Which gets me into, you know, a culling. It's something that is not pleasant, especially when you don't have a whole heck of cows like we don't, and each one is an individual and you love it. But you got to be able to make those, you know, tough economic calls. If you got an open cow or a cow that's just not performing well, she's got to go. You know, so cut that dead weight on your feed expense. But also on the other side, the income side, you're generating cull cow income. And so, you know, it's a win-win. You're knocking off a low performer that you got to feed, and you're making some money from her. So you got to make sure that you're culling appropriately. And when we're culling, we're
sell your cull cows to just to regular market or to other?
No, I sell them as burger.
So it's that's also a limitation with culling, is the processing dates too. But
yeah, it's a challenge. Yeah, processing dates. I don't have any solution for you other than book early and often. I mean, on a mature cow calf operation, you're going to be looking at anywhere from 15 to 20% culling per year. And so, like, if you know that you're going to have a certain percentage of cull cows, well, you better book at least that many dates for processing if you're going to do direct sales like I do. If you're just selling them to a, you know, auction barn, then I guess that doesn't matter. But I really recommend, I mean, especially right now, everybody is looking for beef. And I know it's too little too late if you don't have butcher dates locked in already, but you can sell a burger for $4 or $5 a pound easy. And you're going to make way more money doing that than you will selling her for $700 down at the auction barn. So yeah, I highly recommend just grind her up, and you'll make money if you can move the burger, which you shouldn't have any issue doing. So when we're culling and selecting animals for grazing systems, this is a picture I stole from Jim Garish. You know, we want to look for good body depth on cattle. Short legs, big rumens, round bodies, sprung ribs, you know, well-rounded back ends. Don't want to see any bones poking out. And the biggest thing that Aaron and I always look for, my wife has an excellent eye for cattle, and she's always saying, oh, that one's too leggy. Not enough depth on that one. And so what she's referencing is that you want to have much more body than air when you look at a cow. So if a cow is this tall, you want 65% of that space between her back and the ground to be filled with cow and not with air. So this is a really nice cow. We've got 69% body depth and only 31% air underneath. And so what this is an indicator of is a really low maintenance animal. Oops, this is going automatically on me. Yeah, as Jim says, there's no retail value below the belly. You know, you got a little bit of shank meat down here. That's not worth diddly. So you want animals that have really good body depth. Easy keepers, you know, is the phrase. And as Jim says, you know, as cows get bigger, farm income declines. Because those animals have higher maintenance costs, you're spending more money just to keep those cows alive. And so it reduces your net revenue. Another herd management thing that is worth discussing is the discussion of how you're going to breed your cows. So you're going to own a bull, you're going to rent a bull, or you're going to AI. And I will say there's no right answer to that. It's going to vary from farm to farm. So this is the Lux right here. This was our very first bull that we bought. He was a purebred registered Belted Galloway. Oh, he was a beautiful bull. He's still alive. He's up in where is he? Iron River, Michigan. Yeah, some guy bought him from us there. But beautiful bull, really docile, nice guy. That was a terrible financial decision. You know, we had 6 cows, and we bought a $2,000 bull to breed 6 cows. I mean, that was in hindsight, it was a stupid decision to make. Now, granted, we sold them for $2,000, you know, so I guess we got our money back out of them, but we had to care for them for 2 years. And the biggest thing is owning a bull means you got to manage the bull for 12 months when you only need him for 2. And so, not saying that owning a bull isn't a good idea in the right scenario, but you need a lot of cows in order to justify owning a bull. We've been renting bulls the last few years, and that's worked out really well. You know, it costs you $300 or $500. He shows up, he does his job for 2 months, and he's gone. That's worked out really nicely. As far as artificial insemination goes, I mean, there's no faster way to jumpstart your genetics than using AI. I mean, you got your pick of the litter of any bull in the country. The kicker is that you got to be able to manage to actually get the job done. We are very much interested in going to AI. In fact, we bought some Red Devon semen at the Grassworks auction a couple of years ago, and I never got it because we'd have to be running cows back and forth to a handling system, or else we'd have to be keeping them, you know, locked up for a couple of weeks while we were doing AI. And to me, it just wasn't worth it. You know, renting a bull for me is just much easier, but it's definitely something that I would consider in the future, and it might be the right fit for you. But so thinking through not only the financial aspects of these decisions, but also the logistic decisions. You know, does it fit your lifestyle? Does it fit your scenario? You know, Aaron and I both work off farm, so we're not around all the time to be watching for heats. And if we were going to do a timed sync AI, then we'd have to be handling them a ton. So for me, that's just not something I want to do right now. But again, figure out what's the right scenario for you, because you might be, if you think you got to own a bull, that might be a drag on your finances, as well as a drag on terms of you got to keep this stupid galoot around for a whole year that you don't really want them for. So if I'm bulls. So overheads and capital expenditures. This is one of my favorite things to rail about. In 2010, that SARE study that Laura did, they attributed about $100 a cow in overhead expenses. So when we're talking overhead, what are we talking about? We're talking about the cost of buildings, equipment, fuel, repairs, maintenance, all that sort of stuff that goes into owning and operating a farm. That's not a direct expense or not a direct production expense. And so there's an old saying that you should avoid buying things that rust, rot, and depreciate. And that is absolutely true. Those are words to live by. And so while it's nice to have nice things, when you're trying to make money at this, you really need to interrogate every purchase of equipment or building or whatever the case may be. So are these things really necessary? You know, tillage equipment, haying equipment. I think you know where I stand on owning haying equipment. A barn. Barns, oh my goodness. Especially for raising beef cattle, I can't justify putting up a building to house beef cattle. They're just not worth enough to justify that expense. Now, if you've got one already, you know, that's a different story, but to put one up, that's a tough sell for me. We'd have to run the numbers. Planting equipment. Big truck and trailer. I got a really nice young guy I work with, AJ Waller Livestock, if anybody's interested. He's got a livestock hauling business. So anytime I need to move animals to the butcher or whatever, I call him up, and $50 later, those animals are on the trailer and they're gone. He also hauls on my hay for me, you know, so he's got a flatbed that he picks up 22 bales at a crack with. You know, you just cannot justify owning that stuff unless you're on a particularly large scale. And I can't tell you exactly what that scale is, but it's probably bigger than most people really are. You know, for the $1,000 a year that I spend paying AJ to haul all this stuff for me, you could never make a truck and trailer payment for that kind of money. So he does it for a living. He's got the business to spread that expense out over all his clients. And so I'm happy to let him do that for me. Plus, I don't have the time involved in going and moving stuff around. Another one, manure spreader and skid steer. That's pretty ubiquitous on most farms. Do you really need it? I will talk more about that. How about a tractor? Now, I own a tractor. I put this in here because Steve Kenyon, if any of you are familiar with Steve Kenyon, he's a grazer from Alberta. One of his points of pride is that he doesn't own a tractor and he doesn't own any land. You know, so he runs a complete custom grazing operation on rented land, and he doesn't own anything except for a bale truck and an excavator that he uses for making ponds. And so, you know, very interesting guy, a lot to learn from him. And so that's something that he takes great pride in. More on depreciation overhead. Here's another Aaron Papism for you. Buying stuff is a quick way to go broke. You really need to justify every purchase. And here's the problem though. So you really want that skid steer. You really want that manure spreader. Say, oh, this will make my life so much easier. Okay, well, it probably will. But is it going to actually pay for itself and then some? And then because you have that piece of equipment, now you find ways to use it to justify the purchase to begin with. While I have it, I might as well use it. Well, every time you're using that piece of equipment, you've got fuel repairs and maintenance costs that go into that as well. And so it's kind of a downward spiral that goes on. Now, I'm not saying that you shouldn't ever own any piece of equipment. I mean, it's just not practical. But again, interrogate the finances. Is it really worth doing? You really need to have considerable acres and sell a whole heck of a lot of beef in order to justify this stuff. You know, like a no-till drill. My poor wife, she's had to listen for 7 years probably about how much I want a no-till drill. I would love to have a no-till drill and all the cool stuff I could do if I owned a no-till drill. All the awesome, you know, intercropping and forage plantings I could do if I had a no-till drill. But you know what? Abe Good shows up with his 25-foot no-till in the spring, and I pay him $20 an acre, and that's the end of it. He's done in an hour what would take me all day, and so I just really can't justify the purchase, at least not right now. Same thing for hay balers. You know, anything that you really it's going to take you more than a few years to pay yourself back. You got to look long and hard at whether that's really something that you need to be spending money on. What should you be spending money on? Income producing assets. And what are our income producing assets? Cattle. More on reducing overheads in regards to winter management. So wintertime is probably where we spend most of our money in overheads and in equipment. So we've got all these hay bales, so we got to be able to move those bales. And so we got to have something to move them, whether that's a skid steer or a tractor, you know, you got to have something to do that with. What if we're raising animals you know, on a feed pad or in a barn or something? Well, we've got the infrastructure of that structure or that feed pad or whatever. Now we got to have a skid steer to scrape it. We got to have a manure spreader to spread that manure. And so you can see how this stuff just starts to pile up. You know, when we first started farming, I said, oh, if only I had a piece of concrete that I could put my cattle on in the winter because I hate the soil damage. But if I had that, then I need all the stuff that goes along with it in order to manage that manure. And so what we've had to do, and I think has been a very valuable experience for us, is find ways not to spend money for winter management. And so what we've gone with is bale grazing, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So, you know, we set out our round bales in the fall in a couple of days with the tractor, and then our feed is set. We use bale rings to control access to the feed so we can reduce waste. Use your poly wire to control access to the rest of the square or to the grid. And so you just move them, you know, one row at a time and flip the bale rings as you go. Works really well. There is some waste, and that's the big complaint people always say with bale grazing. But when you use rings, there's not a whole heck of a lot of waste. Another big thing is you feed halfway decent quality hay. They don't waste near as much as if you're trying to feed them really cheap, crummy stuff. And then what waste there is, the cattle bed on it. So I don't bed at all during the winter time for the most part, unless it's a really, really cold storm coming. I might go unroll a bale for them. But yeah, the animals lay on it. And so it's dual purpose sort of. And then this is my barn. You know, this is a bunch of pallets I got for free. Even that little steel structure, I got that from a fellow farmer for free. Drive some T-posts in the ground, slide those pallets over it. This is from a couple of years ago. Now I've got a fancy shade cloth. I spent $80 on a shade cloth that I can wrap around the whole thing so that they can get better protection. You can see this is right before a big snowstorm coming, so I did unroll a hay bale behind here for them. I don't really like to do that though, because then you end up with like big nasty bed pack out in the middle of your pasture that you got to deal with the next spring. So I really try to avoid bedding them as much as possible. They got plenty to lay on out in the bale grid. And really, except for the crummiest days, they're going to spend 90% of their time out there in the bales. They're not going to spend a whole heck of a lot of time behind that wall unless it's crummy. But you got to have something out there for them to protect them from the wind. And this does the trick. Very, very cost effective. All right. So I'm kind of getting to a summary here. So reducing costs. Pretty much everything we talked about so far has been how to reduce our costs. So we can make first crop hay off part of our pastures. Just make sure we're managing our nutrients appropriately. One of my favorite things, buy hay when it's cheap. You know, this is why it's important to have good working capital. Cash is king, and when a deal strikes, you want to be able to capitalize on that. Making hay off your hay fields oftentimes isn't worth it unless you're able to make good quality hay. And of course, in years of really high hay prices, then you're going to be happy that you had it. But if you're being strategic about stockpiling hay when it's cheap, you can mitigate that for the most part. Like I said, I've got 3-year-old hay I'm going to feed this year, so I didn't have to buy anything this year if I didn't want to, but I had some good deals walking the yard, so I took advantage of them. The biggest takeaway, if you learn nothing else tonight, is that the #1 thing you can do to reduce your costs is to graze as long as possible. So we do that with our stockpiling, finding ways to graze covers, and using annuals appropriately to be able to extend our grazing season. A lot of different herd management that we can do, culling cows and selecting for efficient animals. Don't spend too much on equipment and buildings. Overheads are a real killer. I said that $100 a cow is what the average was that Laura Payne found. Well, that's an extra $100 an animal you got to make just to justify owning the farm, basically. Find ways to not spend money. Instead of saying, and this is a mindset I have to challenge myself with all the time, instead of saying, how can I spend money to make my life better, figure out how can I do things without having to spend money. So everybody likes to have fancy stuff and nice things, but particularly in a beef operation, the margins are slim. So you got to make do with what you can. Spend money to make money, and that's on animals. Again, graze as long as possible. So I'm going to start talking about some other stuff. Anybody have any questions on that?
I guess Megan's question was, okay. As far as spending money on cows and the importance of grass-fed genetics, do you have comments on that?
I do. When I say spend money on cows, I shouldn't say cows. I should say cattle. Cows are generally a bad investment. Cow-calf operations are generally the lowest margin operations, but buying fit steers, calves to finish is generally a pretty good idea. I'll actually get into that a little bit more. But yeah, I would say if you're going to buy cows, buy good ones. It does make a difference. Like we've got some really nice cattle that we got actually through a farmer who was getting out from the grass-fed beef co-op, and that's how we got our starter herd. And they're really nice animals, good grass-based genetics. And when we buy in a lot of animals, and they don't look near as good as the ones that we've got at home. But the funny thing is that the ones that we buy are good enough. You don't want to buy just anything, but at the same time, you don't need to go spending top dollar on animals either. I had a guy try to sell me some cows about a year ago that he wanted, what was it, $3,000 a cow, because he had the most beautiful grass-fed animals you could ever expect, but cripes, $3,000 on a cow. I mean, you never make that back. So I don't know, I guess that's what I have to say about it. Yeah, cows are important, and good cows are important, but you got to be reasonable. You got to be able to justify spending that kind of money on an animal. I don't know if that even answered your question. Was that?
There's another question about minimizing compaction and tearing up the pasture when the ground isn't frozen in winter.
Yeah.
Yeah, so during the thaw, the mud season.
Do you know a way how to do it? If you know, let me know. I mean, you concentrate animals, they're going to make soup, in March and April. That's just that's the name of the game. Unrolling bales, I think, is a potential way to mitigate that. You're spreading them out so that you're not all crowding around a bale ring. I don't have a bale unroller, and so doing that is a real pain. I think I actually get more waste from unrolling bales when we do it than when I do feeding in a ring feeder. So yeah, I mean, there's trade-offs, but I definitely think that there's certainly ways to get around it. Now, like if I had a piece of concrete to put cattle on for 6 weeks in the springtime, I'd probably do it. But then I'd hire a kid down the road with a skid steer and manure spreader to get rid of the manure for me. I definitely wouldn't want to own a spreader just for that. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. But that's been a big challenge for me. And the way I've tried to mitigate it, I found the best way to do it is just till it up and start over. Plus, it allows me a place to put that sorghum Sudan grass, which I really like having in my rotation. So I found a system that works well for me, but I wouldn't say it's perfect by any means. All right, so now we're gonna look at the other side of the equation. We looked at cost, now this is income. So how can we raise our price? That's probably the first place to start. Well, so if we're gonna sell animals to like the grass-fed co-op, they've got a tiered pricing system. So like you meet choice, you're gonna get $235. You meet high select, you're gonna get $225. Low select, $215, and standard is $205 or something like that. And so let's say on average, we're gonna get $221 a pound for our animals. Well, what if we are able, through good grazing management and through good selection of those cows that we own, to be able to finish higher quality carcasses? So now we're going to hit more of those top tier pay prices. So now we're increasing our pay price at $229 a pound instead of $221 a pound. Well, that's going to pick up another $18.20 an acre, just by being able to finish higher quality cattle, get that extra premium for our animals. So that's a nice way. How about direct marketing? So my business is direct marketing, and there's definitely a lot of potential. Obviously you set your price when you're direct marketing. And so in my spreadsheet here, I've got a selection where you can put in animals you're going to direct market versus sell through the co-op. And so right now it's at 0, that gives us $38. But let's just say we're going to direct market 3 steers. This is saying that I think this is a very reasonable goal. Most people should be able to move 3 steers in between family and friends and close acquaintances or whatever. You can probably find enough people to move 3 steers directly a year. But just selling 3 steers a year raises our revenue from $38 an acre to $113 an acre. If we're charging $375 a pound. And so, that makes a huge difference on the bottom line. We picked up $75 an acre just by selling those 3 steers alone. Now, challenges of direct marketing, they are many. It takes time and effort. If you're doing a good job of it, it's going to take, it's going to take time. And it's a different set of skills from production. If you're farming, you're focused on those production things. Well, these are people skills. You're doing a lot of communications. You're doing advertising, inventory management, order management. I talked with customers 4 times today. Like that's the name of the game. So you got to be able to do those sorts of things well. There's also additional direct costs involved with direct marketing. So we've got probably additional packaging costs. So like we use custom labels so our stuff looks nice. You've got a website that you got to pay for and maintain. You've got additional fuel and truck and time, for dealing with the meat, freezers. I mean, all sorts of stuff that are additional costs that you accrue. Unless you're just doing, a few quarters and halves or whatever a year. If you're doing this on any sort of scale, it's going to cost you something. And then you have to balance production and sales. So like this year, this was like a nightmare. Everybody wanted meat for COVID. And so they're calling you up saying, I need beef. Well, it takes 2 years to produce a finished steer. So you can't just turn on a light switch and you've got meat in the freezer. So, you know, we managed to buy in a bunch of animals that we were able to finish. But then the bottleneck became processing, like you said before, Rachel. You know, you can't get a butcher date to save your life. And so being able to balance that production and sales, you can't sell what you don't produce, but you shouldn't produce what you can't sell. And so trying to manage both ends of the operation, you know, that's another thing that you got to deal with. But it's totally worth the effort. So again, this is not accounting for the additional marketing costs, and especially the time involved in it. But so we're saying now, instead of selling 3 steers a year, we're going to sell 10 steers. Yeah, 10 steers a year. And so now our revenue per acre is $288 an acre. So direct marketing definitely improves the bottom line as long as you're charging appropriately. You can still lose money in direct marketing if you're not accounting for all of your true costs. So keep that in mind. If you're interested in learning more about doing direct marketing well, I highly recommend looking into Charlotte Smith. Her company's called 3 Cow Marketing. She's got a podcast that's free, Profitable Mindset podcast. I listen to quite a bit. She's got some really good advice on how to do direct marketing well. So there's other people out there like Seven Sons. They've got some classes and stuff, but it's worth investing plenty of time and a little bit of money into doing this well. All right, some other stuff, increasing production. So if we're doing a good job managing our pastures, improving soils, improving water holding capacity, all that sort of stuff, we'll definitely see a bump in our pasture productivity. We've certainly seen that on our farm. You know, in the 4 years we've been grazing our pastures, productivity has continued to go up every year. And so in our baseline scenario, we put in 1,200 pounds dry matter per acre per rotation. We bumped that up to 1,400 pounds and we picked up 200 more pounds of dry matter. Now our stocking rate was able to go up a little bit. And so we've got additional animals that we can sell. And so from our baseline scenario, we picked up $6 an acre. I mean, it's not anything crazy, but we didn't even have to pay for it. You know, it's just a side benefit of doing good grazing management. Enterprise selection. So this is something I think that me personally have to take a closer look at, and I think a lot of farmers would do well to really examine, are you doing the best enterprise for your particular situation, you know, for your land base or the equipment that you own or your skills as a marketer or whatever the case may be. Are you in the enterprise that best serves you? So what kind of grazing is going to make you the most money? You know, cow-calf, that's kind of like the default cattle grazing scenario. In general, cow-calf operations are the least profitable enterprises of pretty much any grazing operation. Stockers, you're buying calves in the spring and selling them in the fall. Just selling, you're basically making money on your weight gains. Grass finishing through a branded program, be that Wisconsin Grass-Fed Beef Co-op or Strauss or Thousand Hills, one of those types of deals, or are you going to do grass finishing direct marketing? Or how about custom heifer raising? You know, like Ron Shep, I don't know if he's on here tonight. Ron Shep down in Sauk City, he does custom heifer grazing. You know, that's his business. So a lot of different opportunities out there. You just got to really examine each one and run the numbers and see which one is really going to be the most economical for you. So here's something that I think comes up quite a bit and is a bit contentious is, should you own cows or should you just buy in calves? This is a discussion that my wife and I have all the time. So again, looking at our baseline scenario here, we have 15 cows producing 14 calves, you know, 90% calving success. That gives us that $38.50 an acre. Well, what if instead of having 15 cows, we just buy in a whole bunch of calves every year? And so we can have 27 calves a year, you know, and we have 27 finished 2-year-olds to sell every year. In that scenario, our pay price down here is $1.45 a pound. Sorry, I gotta move this. There we go. $1.45 a pound and a 450 pound calf. So that gives us a purchase price of $653 a head. Well, that means that we actually are making more money buying calves than we were owning those cows. However, if we raise the price that we're paying for those calves to $1.50, well, now we're actually $1 behind on owning those cows. So it's a tricky situation. You know, I wouldn't say that there is any, you know, there's no one size fits all scenario, but it's worth going through the exercise of really honestly assessing if this is the right mix of livestock on your land. For us, you know, we have a small number of cows. We're going to have 10 brood cows next year, big time, you know, and so we buy in a bunch of calves every year to meet our demand. I got 8 calves that are going to be coming next week to supplement our herd. So for us, we found that a mixture is actually a really nice fit for us. We like our cows. We definitely think that they're nice animals. In fact, so like, here's an example. So this guy right here, this is one of our homegrown ones. This is Danny, really nice fit, full body, good depth, nice round butt. And like these two are calves that we buy in from a farm down the road. Definitely leggier, a little bit bonier. So they're not quite as nice animals, but they're good enough. You know, they finish just fine. You know, they're hitting that 600, 650 pound carcass range. They finish fine. They're not anything exceptional, but they're, like I said, they meet our expectations. And so that's good enough. And so instead of me going out and buying a bunch of cows to try to up our herd numbers, and then I got to feed those cows, it works better for me to, as we slowly build our herd internally, to keep buying in calves. Much better cash flow than buying cows. All right, then stacking enterprises. So probably a lot of you have multiple enterprises on the farm, and we're the same. Like I said before, we do pastured pigs and pastured chickens as well. Some of you might have sheep or goats. You know, who knows what other things, turkeys, ostriches. I mean, the opportunities are endless. And so if we're running multiple livestock enterprises on the same acres, utilizing those acres slightly differently though, then we're able to generate more revenue per acre. And so here's an example. So here's my pigs and my cows separated, you know, just by a poly wire. And so we're literally utilizing the same pastures at the same time for our operation. The chickens are a great example. You know, the chickens, they're running across the pasture in our chicken tractors, and the fertility they put down behind them is just phenomenal. And so they're benefiting our cattle operation because of the grass that grows after they go through is just phenomenal. So there's a lot of symbiotic relationships that can be had by stacking multiple livestock enterprises together. That being said, I would say particularly if you're starting out, don't jump into 3 enterprises at once. Start with 1, get that one figured out, then add 2, get that one figured out, then add 3. Otherwise you're gonna stress yourself out and not do any of them well. So, but when you get to that point, multiple enterprises are very much a good idea. Here's one that I'm interested in, running sheep and cattle together. I've got some wet compacted areas that were left from our cash cropping predecessors that grow a lot of ragweed and sedge, stuff that the cows really don't want to eat. And so I would love to get some sheep in that might actually utilize those things. So that's something I'm thinking about, you know, going towards. But again, some symbiotic relationships that could potentially be had by utilizing multiple livestock species on the same acres. Again, looking at different enterprises. So like here's a screenshot from Stockers. Instead of having 15 cows on that 40 acres, we're going to have 50 stockers, 700-pound stockers. And, you know, if the price is right, we can make $103 an acre, and that's after fixed costs, which we haven't really been looking at too much on the other one. So I think stockers are a good enterprise for sure. Only problem is that there is quite a bit of risk involved, you know, depending on what you buy them for and what you sell them for. You know, the markets change, and so there is some definite price risk there. But in general, you know, I think stockers are another good enterprise that somebody could do. So here's kind of my big overall synopsis here. So in order to reduce costs, what do we want to do? We want to reduce our stored feed costs, find some cheaper feed, pick up hay on good deals, maybe make hay strategically, extend our grazing. That's the big one. Figure out how to graze more days. Every day we're grazing is a day we're not feeding. That's money in your pocket. Utilize profitable herd management, you know, select for good, efficient cows, cull when you have to. Really watch out for your overheads and capitalization. Don't spend money on stuff that isn't going to make you money. And then how we increase our income, can we get better quality cattle so we get a higher price for them, do direct marketing, increase our productivity of our pastures, and look at different enterprise selections and then stacking those enterprises on the same acres. So if we put all this stuff together, or at least some of this stuff together, where does that get us? So if we reduce our feed costs from $100 a ton to $95 a ton, because we stocked up on a good hay deal last year, we're able to extend our grazing season 30 days, maybe because we're doing some stockpiling or we found some cover crops to graze for a few days or something. We're hitting tier 1 price 60% of the time, so we're getting that $2.29 price if we're selling at the co-op, because we got those better grazing management, better cow genetics. We've increased our forage production through good grazing. Where do we get with that? We went from $38 to $208 an acre, so that's $170 an acre improvement. None of that stuff by itself has an enormous impact, but you put it all together, and now we're getting somewhere. So we take into account some of our fixed costs, and we got our land charge. So if we own the land, that's our taxes, insurance. If we're renting it, obviously that's your rent. Pasture costs. So this is like if you're clipping, fuel and tractor wear, stuff like that, from pasture management, fertilizer, that sort of stuff. And then depreciation. So wear and tear, replacement on equipment, machinery, buildings, etc. We add that into the equation and we get our true net farm return per acre of $93.52. So is anybody going to become a millionaire doing this? No. But is there money to be had? Absolutely. We put all the pieces together, do the management required, make good decisions, and we can make money at this for sure. Better than we can growing corn and beans. Remember that $70 was the best case scenario if we ignored a whole bunch of other costs in growing corn. And so one thing I should note is that I always charge $50 a head in labor to the livestock. And so $2,500 of these variable expenses is actually labor. And if you're doing the work yourself, well, that's money you're paying yourself. So on a cash basis, it's actually a return of $156 an acre. So again, this is kind of a best case scenario if you do everything right, but it shows that the opportunity is absolutely there. So some things on keeping tabs of our finances. So you can't manage what you don't measure. Got to keep good records. And this isn't just for taxes, tracking income and expenses. Make sure that you're actually keeping track of what enterprise an expense goes towards. So if we've got cattle, chicken, and pigs on our farm, like I do, make sure that you're attributing each expense to each enterprise instead of just a generic, farm expense. Schedule F isn't going to tell you how much money you made on cattle versus how much you made on chicken, or how much it costs you to feed your cattle versus how much it costs you to feed your chickens. So you got to keep track of that stuff on your own. And be an honest banker. A lot of us have off-farm jobs, and we're probably supplementing the farm with those off-farm jobs. But that doesn't mean that the farm doesn't have to make money. If it's your hobby and you really don't ever expect to make any money on it, fine. But don't push the rest of us out with your low prices. Steve Kendon always says that if everybody who was in the beef business that wasn't making money at it would get out, then the rest of us could make money. And I thought that was a funny observation. And so just be honest with where the money's coming from in your farming operation. There's nothing wrong with supplementing your farm with your off-farm income, but just be clear about where that money's coming from. So as far as record keeping, this is a spreadsheet that I use from the University of Missouri. It's nothing fancy. This is just the expenditures page from it, but it's got a bunch of categories that help me really be accurate about what kind of expense this is. It also allows me to track things by enterprise. So that's what I use for my day-to-day bookkeeping. QuickBooks. A lot of people use QuickBooks. Works great. Just got to make sure that you set it up for with your farm categories so that you can keep track of things appropriately. If you want to do a deeper dive into what your cost of production actually is, this is a spreadsheet called Livestock Compass that Jim Munch created. You can download this through Center for Integrated Ag Systems at UW. Just Google Livestock Compass CIAS, you'll find it. This is a really worthwhile thing to do. So you put in all your expenses, and there's a number of input pages where you got to allocate every farm expense to something, be it to growing pasture, to growing forages, to producing beef, whatever the case may be. You got to allocate it somewhere. And then it gives you an enterprise analysis on what it actually cost you to produce a pound of beef, what it costs to produce a pound of chicken, that sort of thing. And so it helps you figure out what is my true cost and what do I need to be charging, particularly for direct marketers, in order to make money appropriately at this. So I highly recommend everybody do that exercise at the end of the year. This is a rearward looking analysis, like most financial analysis. So January 2nd, I sat down and did this. I'm going to do the same thing again this year. Figure out where were we at for the year. Now, the one caveat that FinPac doesn't, or excuse me, that Livestock Compass doesn't take into account is that it does things simply on a cash basis, not an accrual basis. So accrual means basically accounting for inventory changes. So if your farm is growing, so you're producing more animals, you're buying in feed for animals you don't have yet, or you're buying in breeding stock, that sort of thing, this is going to make you look really bad because you've spent money on things that you're not getting a return on yet. And so that's where doing something like a financial analysis through FinPac. FinPac is a software that is put out by the University of Missouri, or excuse me, University of Minnesota Center for Farm Financial Management. So anybody can get this software. It's very expensive. It's something I use all the time as a farm business instructor. This is a lot of what we do, is doing these financial analyses. And so here we're taking into account accrual inventory changes. So let's say on a cash basis, you spent a whole bunch of money because you bought 2 years worth of hay because it was a good deal. So if you look at the bank account, it says, oh geez, I spent a bunch of money this year, I did really badly. Your Schedule F is going to look like garbage. But if we look at your actual net worth, because I have a bunch of hay sitting there that has value that I've saved up now, if we look at your total net worth, it's actually gone up. And so FinPac allows us to be able to do these accrual adjustments on animal and livestock inventory, or livestock and feed inventories in particular, equipment, looking at depreciation in terms of earned net worth. So doing a FinPac is a really valuable thing if you really want to dig into the guts of what's it take, what am I spending money on, where can I make improvements? And so that's a lot of what I do in my job. So a quick plug. So I'm a farm business instructor at Northeast Wisconsin Tech College. So I do those financial analyses and other financial stuff. Pretty much any sort of production questions, I do crop scouting. I do help with nutrient management planning, all that sort of stuff. Just basically you need general farm assistance, anything you need help with. Went out and calibrated a guy's drill the other day when he was planting winter wheat, anything, we're basically on call. And then in the wintertime, we do a 12-week winter class, 2 hours a week. So pretty low commitment, field days and seminars and stuff throughout the year. So you get all that for $600 a year. So I'll give my plug for the program. So if you're interested, get in touch with me. All right, so that's into that. I think I'm probably running over here, Rachel, aren't I? As far as what I'm supposed to get to.
That's all right. Yeah, if people want to stick around, we'll keep recording too. If you have to go, you can check back and then move ahead. But
I'm almost done with this, but maybe you got to look at the spreadsheet still. So I'm sorry.
That's all right. This is good stuff. All
right. So here's my 2 cents on making the transition. So if you've never grazed before, or you're going to convert some cropland or something, here's some things to watch out for. First things first is we've got to understand economics versus finance. Economics, the question we're trying to answer is, does this make money long-term? And so we're looking at, long-term profitability. If I do this, am I eventually going to make money at it? Finance is can I afford to do this? So this is basically looking at, can I cash flow this? What is it going to take? What kind of upfront capital investment is this going to require in order for me to get to that point of making money? And so those are two very different questions, but we have to answer both of those in order to be able to have a successful operation. There's a lot of farms successfully cash flowing that are not profitable. And you can also have profitable farms that aren't cash flowing, but they never get to that point because they run out of money. And so you got to be able to do both. All right, so some financial pitfalls, the startup costs. It costs money to get into this. You know, you got to put up a fence, you got to plant your pastures, you know, get fertilizer, whatever, all that sort of stuff. It's a significant investment. But luckily we have NRCS. So if you aren't familiar with NRCS programs, they will cost share on fence, water infrastructure, seeding costs, stuff like that, that really seriously defrays the cost of getting into this. And so I highly recommend anybody that is looking to get into grazing, go talk to your NRCS office and they'll get you hooked up. So that's an easier one to get over if you can get the cost share for it. Biting off too much too fast. So you might have 80 acres or whatever and you want to put it all into grass, and that's great. But if you've never done this before, there's going to be a learning curve, and so you don't want to blow your whole wad at once. The other thing is, you know, how many cattle can you actually afford to buy and feed? So NRCS helps us with the infrastructure, but we actually got to put animals out on the landscape. And so unless you're doing a custom grazing situation, you're going to need to buy some animals and feed for the winter to feed those, unless you're doing stocker operations. So making sure that you have the necessary cash in hand or financing to be able to afford to actually do this stuff. Again, the cattle production cycle. You know, if you're buying open heifers or open cows, that's 3 years before you got something to sell if you're doing grass finishing. And so finding other points in the cattle production cycle that you can make money at in the meantime, if your goal actually is to have a calf to finish grazing operation. And then just a quick note about financing, debt, and cash reserves. You know, I'm fairly debt averse, but financing has its appropriate place. And so it's all going to depend on what your risk comfort level is. And also, what is the actual payback potential on your operation? And so that's where it's really important to be clear-eyed about what the actual payback is on this stuff. Run the numbers, talk to people who are doing it, and get some actual real-life data. Figure out if it's something that you want to bite off if you're going to go borrow money for it. So that's what I'll say tonight about financing and taking on debt. All right, so my big tips for successful transition. If I were to do it all over again, I'd buy stockers. Buying cows is a rough deal to get started because, again, the cattle production cycle, you're looking at 2-3 years before you got anything to sell. So I think stockers are a good way to provide short-term cash flow. You know, we're turning those around in 5 or 6 months, which is nice. And also we get to learn grazing management on a fairly low risk situation, and particularly because we don't have to deal with winter. So we can figure out how to do grazing management appropriately. It's going to take some time. You know, there's a learning curve with grazing. This is our 4th season grazing. I feel like things are really clicking now, but you know, we're learning every day. In the first couple of years, you know, our management was piss poor compared to what it is now. Not that we weren't trying hard. It's just you learn as you go. So doing it in a little bit lower risk situation with a lower cash outlay is a good way, I think, to get started with stockers. Another way or additional way is to buy calves for finishing either before or at least while you're buying cows. So like if you're going to buy cows, buy a complete herd so that you're getting cows, calves, and yearlings all together. So again, we're shortening that cattle production cycle. If you're just going to buy cows and cripes, we got 2 more years before we're going to make any money back on this. So again, figuring out how we can generate some cash flow. Start relatively small. You know, we started with 32 acres. That's what we converted. Now we're up to 60 acres of pasture. I know I'm in the big time, but you know, I'm glad we didn't bite it all off at once because we couldn't afford to stock that many acres. And we've learned as we've gone, and we've learned how to do things better as we've gone on. So only convert as much land as you can afford to forego income on for 2 years. I say that because even if you're going to do something with a quick cash flow turnaround like stockers, you might not make money your first year. You know, you got to learn how this stuff works if you've never dealt with grazing before. And so there's going to be, again, learning curve. and you don't want to get yourself in a risky financial situation. And so my big takeaway here is we want to work toward our long-term goals. You know, if that might, in your case, if that's having a calving to finish beef operation, that's your long-term goal, but we got to cover those short-term cash flow needs in the meantime. And so, you know, buying in calves, running stockers, that sort of thing, to be able to generate consistent cash flow. So some good grazing financial resources. There's some pretty decent spreadsheets on the Wisconsin Extension Beef Information Center, particularly if you're not looking at like grass finishing. They've got stuff on stockers. They got stuff on finishing beef. They got a freezer beef budget for trying to figure out how much you should charge. So they got some nice stuff on there. Some great resources and books by guys like Steve Kinnan, who I've mentioned. He's a hero of mine. Jim Garish, Greg Judy, Julius Rochelle, Joel Sal, and Gabe Brown. You know, all those like big name grazer guys. They've got books and stuff. You can learn a lot from them. Ranch Management Consultants, or RMC. They run the Ranching for Profit School. I've never done it, but I'd love to do it sometime if I had the opportunity. But their articles and resources are really good. They're more focused on kind of like rangeland cow-calf operations for the most part. But a lot of those principles are universal to any sort of grazing scenario, particularly the financial management. I love the Working Cows podcast. Listen to it every week. Clay Connery's the host. He brings in all the big names and everybody you've never heard of, but you learn something every week. I really like that podcast. Reading On Pasture, Graze, publications like that, Stockman Grass Farmer, that's all really good stuff. All right. I know, I'm sorry, that was longer than I was supposed to go, so I apologize. Anybody got any other questions? Here's my contact info. If you have any questions or want to bug me, that's my work email. I think Rachel sent out my personal email too. Either one's fine. That's my phone number. If you want to get involved with the farm business program, you know, or just whatever grazing talk, get a hold of me. I'm sorry, Rachel. I'm a bad boy. Rachel, you're muted.
Well, that's fine. So I included in the chat the Grassworks Ask a Grazer resources.
Absolutely. I apologize for neglecting that. Yeah, Rachel started that. It is an awesome resource.
Yeah, I think that just being able to ask straightforward questions to other people and gain their experience, like we got to hear from Aaron. Everyone's got kind of a different take on things. So utilizing that as a resource. The other plug I wanted to maybe mention too is, the upcoming Grassroots Conference, and Grassroots is doing an offering of Kiss the Ground with Gabe Brown doing a live Q&A. So that's going to be November 11th, 12th. So kind of penciling in that date, details to come. Those are just kind of things that I wanted to plug before people start jumping off. But if people have any questions right away for a general discussion, feel free to put them out there. Otherwise, definitely a round of applause to Aaron. We're not in a big room where you can get the full effect, but I think you really shared some great points for all of us. And I've seen this presentation a number of times, and I still get more out of it each time. So anyone got any other closing comments or questions? Otherwise, bring it to the Ask a Grazer resource group, and we can really get a heated debate going on some of this stuff.
Yeah, and I was supposed to go through the spreadsheets. Clearly, I'm over time. If you got questions on them, particularly the grass finishing one could be a little complex to navigate. I'm not like an Excel wizard, but I've made a tool that's useful for me for, projections. And really what it was intended for to begin with was to help convince crop farmers that it's worthwhile to convert to grazing. So if you got any questions on that, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to help you. The stocker one and the cow-calf one are a little bit simpler to navigate.
And if it does seem like we get a lot of people kind of wanting to, discuss it again too, I mean, we can always do a smaller session too.
Yeah, for sure. That might be that's probably a good idea. So I'm gonna do it one-on-one with everybody. So if that's of interest, I'd be happy to do that.
Yeah, and if anyone didn't get those spreadsheets, yeah, you can probably find my email through Golden Sands, or I can include it. But yeah, message me or message Aaron. So, all right. Well, any other closing thoughts? Everyone can or turn their cameras back on, say goodbye. Or, all right. Well, I think we're gonna call it here unless anyone's got anything else. Yeah, I'll send a follow-up email to all the registration people too, with the spreadsheets and anything else that I come up with in the next couple days. Okay.
Hey,
Well,
Rachel.
yeah,
I noticed
Kevin.
there's like 35 people on. Do you want to do like 10 minutes of discussion, or
Sure.
if
I
anybody
mean, yeah.
on?
What do you got to say, Kevin?
Oh, we've had a really good grazing year. I guess the one thing that's big right now is trying to extend the season out as far as possible. I know you had some pretty good mixes that you did, a couple of cocktails. It's just it's a variable thing. I know on our farm we try to do the graze what grows, quite a bit, and then outwintered areas is where we typically, do the improvement. But we definitely saw, like, even some of these mixes that were 20 inches tall went down to about 3 inches tall with the heavy snow. So we expect some snow in October, but this was pretty high impact for us.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, my sorghum sedan that was 6 feet tall is now, bent, basically it all bent in half. It's still there. The cows are going to have no trouble finding it, but that's why I'm really interested in including corn in my mixes. I'm torn about this because if I have corn in it, then I can't graze it in the summer, but I know it's got to have good standability, because corn is a much tougher plant. So, I'm thinking about, do I plant something in July somewhere as just a one graze situation instead of the 2 graze system that I currently use right now. Include corn to make sure that it's robust enough to stand up to the snow. So, yeah, I feel you.
I know Justin Seeger found that, yeah, having something with a thick stalk and then vetch was the other 2 components that they felt were kind of key in that late season grazing mix. Sherry wanted a clarification about grazing that bale fed area the next summer. So where your bale feed is then where you plant the annuals and then graze that in the summer.
Correct. Yep.
Did I get that?
Yeah, I graze it at the end of July, and then I don't touch it again until that's the last thing I graze in the year. So I'll graze that at the end of November here this year.
I've been curious about people's views on management for grazing dormant. Once the grass is definitely dormant, do people go back through and do a quick graze? I did it on one of mine, and I'm not sure if it. And so I know on Pasture they had an article that just came out today with grazing after dormancy. You've got plenty stockpiled, so you're not even worrying about that. But
Say,
yeah,
Aaron, I have another question about the accessibility of finding some, like if you want to do some contract heifer raising.
Yeah.
That seems to be like one of the more flexible areas where if you have some land, you can avoid that whole outwintering expense potentially. What kind of links do you have with farmers who are looking to do that or to hire a contract raiser?
I'm trying to develop more. Honestly, I don't have any right now. I'm trying to convince them all that they need to put their heifers on pasture.
Right.
I think, some of them are pretty convinced, but it's a matter of making the right connection. And maybe you got some insight on this, Kevin. The challenge with heifers is what age class do we put them out there? So if they're breeding age, 12 to 15 months, Now we got to have some way to breed them. We got to keep an eye on them, you know, and so that becomes much more challenging on pasture. So are we looking at a scenario where we're only grazing them 6 to 12 months, and then they go back somewhere for breeding, and then we put them back out at, you know, 15 to close up? Or are we going somewhere where we've got facilities like Ron Shep, who I mentioned before? He's got facilities that the cattle go up to the barn twice a day to get water and a little bit of corn. And so when they're up there, you know, he can catch them for breeding. So I think there's multiple ways to skin a cat, and it's a matter of making the right connection between how the farmer wants to manage and how the grazer, what opportunities and facilities the grazer has. So I don't know. Do you have any more thoughts about that?
Well, that gets into what type of breeding genetics they want. If they're okay with the bull being with the group, you know, there's
That'd be a lot simpler.
And then it's when you bring in the bull, then it's more fence and more potential dangers and that type of thing. But it's just something I just think anything 6 months on up is usually pretty easy to graze, you know, past that point. The breeding is definitely would be a labor thing you'd have to add in.
Yeah, and that's my biggest challenge that I'm trying to get guys to overcome, you know, is then they got to have somewhere to go with these heifers for breeding, in addition to their pasture. But if they're going to have a heifer barn anyways, a lot of these folks, they're having their heifers custom raised somewhere in confinement. And so where are they going to go if they're going to bring them home for breeding? Because most people are not using bulls to breed their cows, or breed their heifers. Not that they couldn't, but I don't really know of anybody that is, except for use them as a cleanup bull. So, but the right farm could be the right fit for sure. I think apart from that, there's plenty of other, like I said, that 6 to 12 and 15 to 22 months are perfect opportunities to be grazing them. So.
Does anybody else have questions?
There's someone that was asking about experience and knowledge on Eastern gamma grass. So kind of those native warm seeds.
Was that AJ Melberg?
I think
Yes.
so.
Sorry, AJ, I have to get back to you on that. So all I know about Eastern gamma grass is that Marshfield, the Marshfield Research Station, they've been doing some work on that. And what's the heifer guy there? What's his name? Anyways, I forget the guy's name who does that.
I see Nina on here. She went and visited Marshfield. Is she going to chime in?
Yeah, I don't know much about it. They're doing research on it at Marshfield.
Jason Cavadini or who?
No, it's the heifer guy who does like the sorghum sand research. And I cannot remember his name. Bald. Matt Akins.
Oh, okay.
Talk to Matt Akins. But yeah, AJ, I'll get you some stuff on it. I'll talk to Matt.
All right. Well, if no one else has any other discussions, I got little kids to get to bed, so.
Very good.
And myself, probably. All right. Well, thank you again, and we'll be sure to follow up. I'm sure there's going to be another great discussion coming up soon, too. So, and if anyone has any events, feel free to email me those too, and I'll get them on the Grassworks calendar. Again, check out the different resources that Grassworks has. I try to keep up with them. So, all right. Thanks again, Aaron.
Thanks, Rachel.